In December 2013, the body of 47-year-old Matthew Dorsey was found in the living room of his upscale home in Dallas, Texas. An investigation would uncover the tangled and shocking web of betrayal between Matthew, his wife Rachel, and their pastor Lucas Grayson. In mid-2012, at the Harvest of Hope Church, a series of events began that would escalate into secrets, scandal, and a deadly confrontation that shattered a family and left a city reeling. December 25th, 2013, began like any other festive morning in the affluent suburbs of Dallas, Texas. The Dorsey family home, a sprawling, tastefully decorated estate tucked behind wrought iron gates, was alive with the sounds of Christmas. The crackling of a fireplace, the rustle of wrapping paper, and the distant hum of holiday tunes. But beneath the facade of holiday cheer, tension simmered, threatening to boil over. By the time the clock struck 7:15 p.m., the home would be the epicenter of a crime that would shatter the illusion of the perfect family. The 911 call came in at 7:18 p.m., a frantic voice barely coherent. The dispatcher pieced together enough to send officers to the scene immediately. When the police arrived at 7:25 p.m., they were met by an unsettling stillness. Inside the grand living room, Matthew Dorsey, a prominent real estate developer, lay sprawled on the floor. His chest, once the proud and towering figure of a self-made man, now bore the unmistakable mark of a gunshot wound. Blood had seeped into the cream-colored rug, the contrast both horrifying and surreal. Hovering over him, holding a revolver that still carried the weight of its deadly purpose, was his wife, Rachel. Her trembling hands and tear-streaked face painted the picture of a woman on the brink of collapse. The Christmas dinner table told another story entirely. Extended family members, some mid-bite, were frozen in shock. Their faces reflected a mix of disbelief and terror, and none dared to move, as if sudden motion might unleash further chaos. Plates of half-eaten turkey and untouched cranberry sauce sat abandoned. The room, just moments earlier, a space of forced holiday unity, now bore witness to unspeakable tragedy. As first responders moved cautiously into the home, Rachel remained rooted to the spot, her grip on the revolver loose but unyielding. Officers disarmed her without resistance. She seemed dazed, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the body of her husband. It was as if she wasn't fully present, caught in a vortex of shock and memory. By 8 p.m., investigators began piecing together the immediate sequence of events. Statements from family members hinted at an escalating argument during dinner. What had started as a tense exchange of words between Matthew and Rachel had grown louder, more cutting, until Matthew had risen from the table in a fit of rage. The details remained murky, but one thing was clear. A single gunshot had ended Matthew's tirade and his life. Rachel's immediate claims of self-defense added complexity to the unfolding narrative. She was cooperative, almost eerily so, recounting what she could in fragmented sentences. According to her, Matthew's temper had reached a terrifying peak, and in the chaos, she had feared for her life. But other accounts from those at the table raised questions. They spoke of Matthew's reputation as a domineering husband, yes, but also noted Rachel's uncharacteristic calm before the gun was fired. It was a moment of quiet amid the chaos, like the still air before a storm. Forensic investigators combed the scene late into the night. The revolver Rachel held was identified as one Matthew kept in a locked drawer in his study, a detail that led detectives to wonder how it had ended up in her hands during the heat of the argument. The placement of Matthew's body also raised suspicions. He had fallen backward, suggesting he might have been retreating rather than advancing when the shot was fired. These inconsistencies began to cast doubt on Rachel's initial story. By December 26th, news of the incident had already made its way through local media outlets, igniting public speculation. The Dorsey family had long been a pillar of the Dallas elite. Matthew was a towering figure in the real estate world, known for his aggressive business tactics and luxurious lifestyle. Rachel, by contrast, was the picture of Southern grace, charming, soft-spoken, and devoted to her two children. Together, they were the embodiment of success. But as whispers of domestic turmoil and scandal began to surface, the glossy image of their marriage began to crack. The investigation took a dramatic turn on December 30th, when detectives obtained access to Rachel's phone records. Among the mundane exchanges with friends and family were hundreds of messages to one person, Pastor Lucas Grayson. Lucas, the leader of a well-known megachurch in the area, had counseled the Dorseys through their marital struggles for the past 2 years. He was a charismatic figure with a magnetic presence, the kind of man who commanded attention with his every word. The texts, however, hinted at a relationship far more personal than professional. By January 1st, 2014, investigators began to suspect that Lucas's role in the Dorsey household extended beyond spiritual guidance. The messages were emotionally charged, filled with confessions of longing and veiled references to secret meetings. One particularly damning exchange, dated December 24th, revealed an argument between Rachel and Lucas. In the texts, Rachel expressed doubts about continuing their relationship, while Lucas urged her to take control of her life, hinting that she deserved freedom from Matthew's grip. When these revelations reached the media on January 3rd, the case exploded into a full-blown scandal. Tabloids painted Rachel as a desperate housewife entangled in a forbidden love affair, while others vilified Lucas as a predator who had used his position to manipulate a vulnerable woman. Public opinion became sharply divided, with some sympathizing with Rachel's claims of abuse and others condemning her as a cold-blooded murderer. On January 5th, police officially arrested Rachel Dorsey on charges of second-degree murder. She was escorted from her home, her hands cuffed, her expression unreadable. By now, the narrative had become a labyrinth of conflicting accounts and unresolved questions. Was this a tragic accident born of fear and desperation? Or had Rachel, emboldened by her affair with Lucas, planned to rid herself of a husband she had grown to resent? The media's fascination only grew when Lucas Grayson was named a person of interest in the case. He denied any involvement in Matthew's death, insisting that his relationship with Rachel, while inappropriate, had never been more than an emotional connection. Yet his demeanor during interviews raised eyebrows. There was a guarded quality to his words, a calculated tone that suggested he was hiding more than he was admitting. As January unfolded, investigators worked tirelessly to untangle the web of lies, half-truths, and shattered trust that surrounded the Dorsey family. The evidence against Rachel was mounting, but the deeper they dug, the more questions emerged about the role Lucas had played in the events leading up to Christmas Day. The stage was set for a trial that promised to reveal the darkest corners of a seemingly perfect life. Rachel Dorsey's life had been a picture of contrasts, what the world saw and what she lived behind closed doors. From the outside, her world gleamed with luxury. She lived in a sprawling mansion in Dallas, drove an expensive car, and had 2 children who attended the best private schools. Her husband, Matthew Dorsey, was a titan in real estate, known for his ability to close multi-million-dollar deals with ease. But beneath the surface, Rachel's life had become a prison, one where the bars were built out of her husband's perfectionism, his control, and his temper. It was December 24th, 2013, and the pressure of the holidays weighed heavily on Rachel. Every Christmas had to be perfect. Matthew demanded it. He wanted everything to impress their guests. The towering tree in the living room, the elegant table setting, the flawless four-course dinner. Rachel was expected to handle it all, to play her role as the gracious hostess, no matter how broken she felt inside. That evening, after overseeing the final details for Christmas Day, Rachel sat in the quiet of the kitchen, staring out the window at the empty backyard. She thought about the choices she had made over the past 2 years and the tangled mess her life had become. It had all started in 2011, when Matthew suggested they go to counseling. He had noticed Rachel becoming distant, less enthusiastic about their social events, and the life he had worked so hard to build for them. Harvest of Hope Church, a megachurch with thousands of members, offered counseling services, and Matthew believed it was the perfect solution. Their sessions were led by Pastor Lucas Grayson, a man whose sermons could bring tears to a packed room. Lucas had a magnetic presence, a calming voice, and a way of making people feel understood. In those early sessions, Rachel opened up about her loneliness, her sense of invisibility, and the exhaustion of trying to meet Matthew's impossible standards. For the first time in years, she felt someone was truly listening. By mid-2012, those sessions had turned into something else. What began as Lucas offering words of comfort soon became an emotional connection Rachel couldn't ignore. He would send her messages late at night, asking how she was feeling, telling her she deserved happiness. Rachel found herself drawn to him, his attention filling a void she had long ignored. Lucas justified his actions as a spiritual connection, something deeper than the boundaries of traditional morality. Rachel believed him. She wanted to believe him. Matthew, oblivious to the true nature of their connection, welcomed Lucas into their lives. He saw the pastor as a stabilizing influence, someone who could help Rachel find her footing again. Lucas became a trusted family friend, often stopping by the house under the guise of checking on their progress. He charmed their children, Sophie and Will, and even joined them for family dinners. But beneath the surface, Rachel and Lucas were growing bolder. Church retreats, late-night meetings, and secret rendezvous became their reality. By 2013, their relationship was no longer just emotional. As Christmas approached that year, Rachel began to see Lucas in a new light. What once felt like salvation now felt suffocating. He was controlling in ways that echoed Matthew's behavior. He would question her loyalty, demand more time, and press her to make decisions she wasn't ready to make. In the days leading up to Christmas Eve, their arguments had grown more intense. Lucas was tired of waiting. He wanted Rachel to leave Matthew, to run away with him and start fresh. Rachel, torn between guilt and fear, tried to explain why she couldn't. She couldn't risk destroying her children's lives or the fragile peace of her family, even if it was only a facade. Lucas wasn't satisfied with her answers. By the time Christmas Day arrived, the tension was unbearable. Matthew had been drinking since noon, his sharp remarks toward Rachel growing louder and crueler as the day wore on. By 4 p.m., the guests began to arrive. Family members, close friends, and, of course, Lucas. Matthew greeted everyone warmly, his public mask firmly in place. No one would have guessed he had been screaming at Rachel in the kitchen just an hour earlier, berating her for forgetting to chill the wine he preferred. The dinner began at 6:30 p.m. The dining room, adorned with flickering candles and silverware polished to perfection, was a stark contrast to the simmering hostility between Matthew and Rachel. As plates were passed around and small talk filled the air, Rachel avoided Matthew's gaze. Lucas, seated just a few chairs away, kept his attention on her, his presence both reassuring and suffocating. By 7 p.m., Matthew had reached his limit. Rachel's phone, which she had left on the kitchen counter, buzzed with a message. She didn't hear it. but Matthew did. Curious and already drunk, he picked it up. What he saw shattered the veneer of control he had worked so hard to maintain. Explicit messages from Lucas, messages that left no room for misinterpretation, stared back at him from the screen. Matthew stormed into the dining room, the phone in his hand. The atmosphere changed in an instant. Guest fell silent as he hurled accusations at Rachel, his voice slurred but menacing. Rachel stood frozen, unable to respond. Lucas tried to intervene, but Matthew turned on him with fury, demanding to know how long this betrayal had been happening. The confrontation escalated as Matthew lunged at Lucas, his rage blinding him to everything else. The fight spilled into the living room, guests trailing behind in shock. Glasses shattered on the floor as Matthew shoved Lucas against the wall. Rachel, desperate to stop the chaos, ran to Matthew's study. She knew about the revolver he kept locked in his desk drawer, the one he had bought for protection. Grabbing it with trembling hands, she returned to the living room, hoping to stop the violence. At 7:15 p.m., a gunshot echoed through the house. Silence followed. Matthew staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing onto the floor. Blood spread quickly across the pristine carpet. Rachel stood frozen, the revolver still in her hands. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stared at her husband's lifeless body, as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. Around her, the guests remained motionless, their faces pale with horror. Sophie and Will clung to each other, their sobs the only sound in the room. Lucas stepped forward, but Rachel didn't acknowledge him. The reality of what she had done began to sink in, but the reasons, fear, anger, desperation, were lost in the moment. The clock struck 7:18 p.m. as the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. The perfect Dorsey Christmas had become a nightmare that would haunt everyone who had been there for years to come. The day after Christmas, December 26th, the Dorsey home stood eerily quiet. Yellow police tape surrounded the property, its cheerful holiday lights still glowing in the evening gloom. Inside, investigators moved methodically through the lavish rooms, piecing together the events of the previous night. The scene in the living room was frozen in time, a chilling contrast to the luxury around it. A blood-stained rug lay beneath the toppled coffee table, surrounded by shattered glass. The revolver, carefully bagged by forensic technicians, rested on a nearby evidence tray. For the detectives, it was a case with more questions than answers. Rachel Dorsey was brought in for questioning that morning. She sat across the interrogation table, pale and exhausted, her hands trembling as she explained what happened. Her voice was steady, but flat, as if rehearsed in her mind during the sleepless hours since the shooting. She described the escalating argument, Matthew's drunken fury, and how she feared for her life, and for Lucas's. According to Rachel, she had grabbed the revolver out of desperation, pointing it to protect herself and the man she believed Matthew might kill. She painted herself as a woman caught in a moment of pure terror. But the evidence from the crime scene didn't entirely match Rachel's story. As forensic experts reviewed the details that afternoon, inconsistencies emerged. The trajectory of the bullet suggested that Matthew was backing away when he was shot, not charging forward as Rachel claimed. His position on the floor, facing slightly away from Rachel, raised further doubts about her account. These details, subtle but damning, hinted at a possibility investigators couldn't ignore. The shooting might not have been self-defense. By December 30th, Lucas Grayson was summoned for questioning. The charismatic preacher arrived with the confident air of a man accustomed to being in control. He expressed grief over Matthew's death and described the event as a tragedy. But his version of the evening diverged sharply from Rachel's. While Rachel had claimed Matthew was dangerously close to attacking Lucas when she fired, Lucas portrayed himself as the calm peacemaker, trying to de-escalate a violent outburst. He suggested Rachel acted impulsively, her emotions spiraling out of control after enduring years of Matthew's cruelty. The cracks in their stories became glaring. Detectives found text messages on Rachel's phone that complicated the narrative further. One message from Lucas, sent just days before Christmas, encouraged Rachel to stand up to Matthew, to stop letting him control her life. Though Lucas denied any intention of inciting violence, the tone of the message raised eyebrows. It was difficult for investigators to ignore the subtle pressure in his words, especially when viewed in the context of his close, secretive relationship with Rachel. As the investigation continued, the police turned their attention to the children. On January 15, 2014, Sophie and Will were brought in to provide statements, accompanied by counselors to help them process the trauma. Sophie, at just 16, had seen more of her parents' volatile relationship than most realized. She described how Matthew would erupt in anger over the smallest things, his temper unpredictable and terrifying. She also hinted at Rachel's growing instability in the months leading up to Christmas, her mother's mood swinging between nervous energy and deep melancholy. Sophie mentioned how Lucas had become a frequent visitor, someone her mother seemed to lean on more and more, though it made Sophie uneasy. Will, just 14, spoke less, but his memories painted a similar picture. He recalled the moments of tension between his parents, the icy silences that followed Matthew's outbursts, and the strange way Lucas always seemed to be there, hovering just out of reach, but never far away. He admitted he had overheard arguments between Rachel and Lucas, conversations that hinted at something deeper than friendship. By the time the trial began in March 2014, the case had become a media spectacle. National headlines framed it as the perfect storm of wealth, betrayal, and violence. On one side, the prosecution presented Rachel and Lucas as co-conspirators, lovers who had plotted to kill Matthew to escape his control and claim the life they wanted together. On the other, the defense painted Rachel as a battered woman pushed beyond her breaking point, with Lucas's involvement being nothing more than a tragic coincidence. The courtroom was packed as flashbacks and witness testimonies unraveled the layers of the Dorsey family's dysfunction. Friends of Matthew described him as a hard man, but a loving father, someone who demanded a lot, but always provided for his family. Others painted a darker portrait of a controlling husband with a quick temper, prone to drinking too much and lashing out. Rachel's friends spoke of her isolation, her unhappiness hidden beneath the polished image of a perfect wife. They recounted moments where she confided in them about feeling trapped, unable to leave Matthew because of his power and influence. Lucas's history came under scrutiny too. Female congregants from his church testified about his boundary-pushing behavior, flirtations disguised as spiritual guidance, late-night calls framed as pastoral care. One former church member even described how Lucas had once tried to exploit her vulnerabilities during a counseling session, casting doubt on his motives with Rachel. The most shocking piece of evidence was revealed late in the trial. A voicemail left by Matthew on Rachel's phone early on Christmas morning. His voice was slurred, his words laced with anger as he accused her of betrayal. He warned her that if he discovered anything about her and Lucas, there would be consequences. The threat was chilling, but it also raised questions. Did Rachel truly fear for her life when she pulled the trigger? Or was the voicemail the final straw in a plan already forming? The trial's most damning moment came when Lucas's estranged wife testified. She described how Lucas had bragged about having the upper hand over Rachel and Matthew, hinting that he saw their affair as a way to gain power in a relationship where he otherwise felt inferior. Her testimony cast a shadow over Lucas's insistence that he had no role in Matthew's death. After weeks of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Rachel was found guilty of manslaughter, sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 7. Lucas was convicted of coercion and obstruction of justice, receiving a 10-year sentence. As the sentences were read, Rachel sat motionless, her face betraying no emotion. Lucas looked shaken, his confidence finally crumbling. By 2016, the aftermath of the case was still unfolding. Rachel, now in prison, spent her days reflecting on how her life had unraveled. Sophie and Will, living with extended family, struggled to piece together their own lives. The Dorsey mansion, once a symbol of success, stood abandoned, a haunting reminder of the lies, betrayals, and violence that had destroyed a family. Lucas, behind bars, began writing a memoir, blaming his actions on the devil's influence and casting himself as a man who had simply lost his way.